Good evening readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf. It's been a while since I made a video all by myself, but I'm hoping this is going to be the first of several, and I'm aiming to make this into a sort of little mini-series, probably over about the next 6 weeks, about stories from Ukraine. So the situation in Ukraine at the moment needs no introduction if you follow the news at all, but one thing that I like to do sometimes is try to kind of travel to a country mentally through works of literature, and I've done it a couple of times before and after being on BookTube, and I think it's quite an effective way of getting a window into a culture, into a people, into kind of shared experiences that people might have in that context. And I thought it would be maybe quite a useful thing for me to do in terms of understanding what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. It's a very long-winded introduction. It's a bit like a scallydandle, so if you know my mum Roz, scallydandling about the books, she does a little scallydandle to a different country every single month. I don't do it that often, but yeah, this is going to be an extended scallydandle to Ukraine, because I think it's the least I can do in this situation. So I have started by reading a collection of short stories by Oksana Zabuzhko, and it's called Your Ad Could Go Here. So I've read it on the Kindle. Oksana Zabuzhko, one of the reasons I chose her as a starting point is she's a modern writer. So Ukraine's got quite a long literary history, a lot of great poetry, particularly poetry is a big thing, and some writers that we kind of think of as being Russian are Ukrainian, or lived in what is now Ukraine. Anyway, we'll get to those later in the series. My screen is kind of flickering. I hope that's not coming across too much, but we'll find out. Oksana Zabuzhko, she was born in Western Ukraine. She writes fiction, she writes poetry, she writes non-fiction, she lectures at some universities apparently. She is also known for being a very prominent Ukrainian writer. She's been recognised with a lot of awards over time, and a real feminist Ukrainian writer as well. So I thought that sounds like it's really up my street. Her best known work translated into English, I believe, is Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, and she's had another one translated recently called something like the Museum of Abandoned Secrets. But yeah, this collection of short stories I thought was quite an easy inroad, and I would definitely recommend it as a sort of inroad into Ukrainian writing. So in terms of using books to learn about other cultures, I think I got the definite sense from this book that she is potentially aware that people use her writing to learn and understand more about Ukraine, and that is not what she's writing for. So a lot of the stories in this book kind of look at key moments in history, kind of turning points for Ukraine, things that you know, as outsiders we might have seen in the news over the years. This, I should say, was published in 2020, but the stories collected within it stretch back to, I think, around 1998, so they're scattered through time. Some of the significant moments in sort of the Ukrainian national history over that time as well. She's writing these things from an insider perspective, and she's not writing them from an instructive perspective. There's a sense that I got from her writing of, like, if you're not Ukrainian, you're probably never going to quite understand. You know, we as Ukrainians get this, but you as an outsider probably aren't fully going to be able to follow what it is that I'm saying. And not like that's a problem, but she's definitely not writing a step-by-step, you know, easy introduction to these topics, because there is no easy introduction to the complexity of I suppose, what's gone on here over the last few decades and since before that. I found this quite interesting from a translation point of view, because there's about 5 different translators that have worked through the entire collection. Just holding it up again so you can see the cover a little bit more, typical BookTube style. And the main one, I think, was Halina Hrin. Sorry, I'm looking down at my notes. But there's about 5 different ones, and some of them have collaborated. So some of the stories have got multiple translators to them. But what I found was the translator didn't affect the style of the story as much as I had assumed that it would. So I've always thought that the translation has quite a big impact on the end result, I suppose. but I found that I couldn't tell who translated each story. It wasn't a big marker of a difference, and Zabuzhko's style really came through consistently, and that style is quite distinctive. I'd say it's a very literary style, and I don't tend to read literary fiction, but I loved it. I thought it was great. So it's a very it's not exactly, sorry, looking at my notes, it's not exactly a stream of consciousness type style. I have described it to myself as like a stream of events style. Lots of things happen in swift succession. Sentences are very fluid. They run on together. They kind of keep drawing you on. And like incidents come and go and are moved through very, very swiftly. And you are kept, as a reader, you're kept in suspense for the length of the sentence, and then for the length of the page, and then for the length of the story, really. And there is always a bit of a resolution to that suspense, that I found that you're kind of held in a state of slight confusion in a good way, until there's eventually some kind of resolution. I found that I had to focus very hard to read this book, because I don't read a lot of literary fiction probably. But it was enjoyable, and I felt that it was worth it as well. Continuing on from the style and I suppose the themes of the stories, they're generally a bit disturbing at times, and a bit almost psychedelic. I would say that it was almost like being on the teacups at the fair. Like things are kind of whirling around quite swiftly, and sometimes the teacup seems to just like spiral out into Wonderland for a bit and then spiral back into the real world. Characters often don't seem to be quite in control of their actions. The narrative perspective can be quite interesting, and sometimes what perspective you're hearing the story from is one of the things that's kind of held back until towards the end, which had I thought quite an interesting effect. And the main character generally is a woman sort of towards the middle of her life, occasionally more of a younger woman, generally somebody who's involved in creating media, so like a singer, a television presenter, somebody with a degree of kind of public importance or importance within their village, for instance, somebody with a bit of status. And that sounds like things are going to be a bit samey, that they're all focusing on a specific kind of category of women. Often mothers or maternal relationships are very important in these stories, but it's really not. Every story was very distinctive. Every story was very different. The style was unifying. The female feminist perspective was unifying, but each story approached things from quite a unique way. And I think a lot of it kind of looked at how relationships pan out, relationships between men and women, and particularly relationships between mothers and children, and how relationships between men and women might affect relationships between mothers and children, and how current events can impact on those relationships. I found that to be a real takeaway theme for me, like the situation that people are living in and the tension surrounding life if major political events are going on, how that can really play out again in the domestic setting. So I found that fascinating. So I just wanted to talk a tiny bit about a couple of the different stories. I guess I don't want to say too much really. It starts with one called Oh Sister, My Sister, which I think has also been translated as just Sister, Sister. And that's about choices, family planning choices, I suppose. Told from the kind of the angle of a young child who thinks she's got a younger sister, but she doesn't. Living under, probably set, it's not specifically dated, but probably set, this family is living through around about the 1960s. About family planning choices, I suppose, living under quite intense repression. And that is something that Zabuzhko apparently experienced as a child. Her parents were kind of targeted as part of the repression of Ukrainian intelligentsia, which happened at that time. And that actually forced her family to move from Western Ukraine to a different area. So there's definite elements of the personal potentially coming through in these stories. But I felt that was conveyed really well, and that the way that it was told was really interesting. one thing that I didn't expect, I suppose, from not having read any, I don't even think I've read that much Eastern European literature at all. The next story, Girls, talks about maybe like a sapphic relationship between two young women. I didn't expect that from Ukrainian literature, and I didn't expect a lot of the openness and feminism and the strong female characters. Even knowing that I was reading a book by a prominent Ukrainian feminist author, I suppose my expectations did maybe fit a certain category that Zabuzhko definitely does not. So I think that's one of the really good things about reading something from somewhere different, is it does open your eyes a little bit, and it does kind of challenge the internal stereotypes that you might have about that kind of literature or that kind of society. So I enjoyed that aspect. And Girls and a lot of the stories as well looked at kind of judgment of women's sexuality and women's experiences of their sexuality, I suppose. One of my favourite stories in this was The Tale of the Gelder Rose Flute, and it's quite different in tone to the other stories. It's very folkloric. It feels like it's the extended tale of something that you could have lifted out of a folk song. It's got like devils appearing on horseback. It's got rivalry between two sisters, and it's set kind of historically. So most of these stories are set in the late 20th century or very specifically in the 21st century. But this one was kind of in a slightly unknowable time, definitely in the past. I loved it. It was like a sort of dark fairy tale. So I thought that was fantastic. But the best story for me and the most emotionally impactful story for me was An Album for Gustav. And this one looks at the Orange Revolution that happened in the Maidan in Kiev in 2004. And the Orange Revolution was essentially a peaceful uprising in response to an election result that was felt to have been corrupted. In 2014 there was another revolution in the Maidan Square. Maidan means, I think, independence, so the Independence Square. And that didn't end quite so well, and I think there were quite a few fatalities at that point, but the Orange Revolution was peaceful and successful. And I found it a very emotional read because it talks about particularly the elderly women coming out in support of the people who were protesting, and the things that they have lived through over the course of the 20th century in terms of famine and war that have affected Ukraine, and just the image of those old women coming out in support of the protesters, and still living through these situations now. I found that emotional. I just wanted to read a tiny bit actually of An Album for Gustav, just because I found that this isn't a political channel, and I'm not kind of getting into not trying to get into a political discussion, but I felt that the way that it summarised things, to me it was quite beautifully put, and I think she just has such a clarity in what she says. So this is a woman who lives in Kiev, her husband is a photographer who has been photographing the protesters in the Maidan in 2004, and she's translating for a German journalist who has come to the area as well. So I interpreted. The excited German scribbled furiously in his notebooks, and then later he said to me, delighted as a boy, "Isn't it amazing? Just think about it. Your people never knew democracy or justice. They've been ruled by despots the whole time, the Russian Tsars, with terror, persecution, violence, and here the people have risen to defend their rights. It's a miracle." I remember I all but choked with surprise. What do you mean, never knew democracy? Do you people not read? Andreas Kappeler, Kleine, this is a title in German, Kleine Geschichte der Ukraine, doesn't ring a bell. Were you not aware that the Ukrainian head of state, the hetman, was always an elected position? That was what gave it legitimacy. or that we lived for 300 years according to the statutes of Lithuania, the most democratic code of law, if you'd care to remember, of its time. The Russian Tsar cancelled it, of course, but not before 1840, and village courts continue to use it until the beginning of the 20th century. There's even a special genre of charms in Ukrainian folk magic, judicial magic, spells to affect the outcome in court. Kiev obtained the Magdeburg rights in 1494, and other Ukrainian cities had them too. So how do you figure your people never knew the rule of law? I blurted all that out in one gasping fit of patriotic outrage. The German was a little surprised. He thought about it for a moment and then said, "Oh, was that when you were part of Poland?" "The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth," I corrected sternly. She's actually a history teacher, this character. As if he was a C student in one of my classes. "And we also had our own army, nothing to sneeze at, I assure you, and a mercantile middle class. We always had a strong middle class, a nation of small bourgeoisie, you know, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that Stalin hated us as much as he did." "But all of that was a very long time ago," he objected, visibly disappointed. "I think you really wanted to see a miracle, and my academic prissiness was getting in the way. Today's generations don't remember it anyway," he said. We were having this conversation while walking down Institutska Street, sucked into the massive, unanimous whirlpool of people around the Maidan. As one current carried us downhill towards the square, another ascended towards us. The sidewalks were filled with people, the streets studded with myriad flickering lights. People carried candles set in plastic cups, and the whole scene looked like a vast vigil under the eternally dark December sky, lit up from below by the burning fires, flame-like orange clothes and pennants. I was shaky with lack of sleep, with exhaustion, tension, cold and noise, and the answer slipped from my lips before I even realised what I was saying. "As you can see," I said, "we very much do." Yeah, so I like the power of that historian character, and the clarity. And that's one of the few points in this whole collection of stories where it really feels like there's a bit of education going on, and it fits in with the story very well. And yeah, if you were going to read one story from the collection, and they are available separately, I believe they were originally published separately, then I would recommend starting with that one as a bit of, I suppose, an introduction to the author and to the situation. But the whole collection I really enjoyed. It really drew me in, and yeah, grew on me more and more over time. And even just this one collection of stories, I think, has opened my eyes a lot to recent history, to aspects of Ukrainian culture, I suppose. And yeah, I will definitely be reading more. There's definitely going to be at least one more of these. It's going to be a discussing drama one. Roz and I are going to be reading a play by Natalia Vorozhbit, who's another modern playwright, and I'm hoping to do a couple more over sort of the next month or so. But we'll see how it goes. Anyway, let me know if you've read anything by Oksana Zabuzhko down below. I would love to hear if you've read Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, because I'm tempted to read it, but not entirely sure. And yeah, take care everyone, and I will hopefully make another video again soon.